It is Monday morning here, pretty early Monday morning.
Yeah, did you have a nice weekend?
Yes, it was very nice. The big sporting event in the United States. I don't know whether you all pay attention to the Super Bowl, but
Yeah, no, afraid not. But I know how popular it is over there.
it's a big deal here. And my family had a party which I was the host,
Oh, lovely.
so it was good.
Mhm.
And anything we should be talking about before we look at beeps?
So I should say that I did these beeps today only because yesterday I was planning on doing it yesterday, but something came up yesterday which meant I couldn't actually really do it yesterday. But what I did is I'd taken today off work. So in order to get the effect of the weekend today, basically. But the beeps, I did them today, not yesterday.
Okay, that's fine with me. We found that within limits doesn't much matter. The closer to the interview, the better. So that's good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And as I think Cody was saying the last time around, even during work days, people's mind wanders away pretty often. It depends on the person. So I'm glad to have him from a day off.
Yeah, no, I think it's been really interesting doing it on a day when I'm not working actually. To like notice experiences that wouldn't necessarily notice before maybe, or I don't know. Well, I don't know. I suppose it's interesting because I mean, I suppose on a work day, I'm at my computer so much that I think a lot of the beeps would be me at my computer. So,
All right. Well, let's see. Number one.
so, so beep number one, it was at 10 to 12 today, and I was standing at a bus stop, and the beep went off. I was standing at a bus stop in a crowd of people, and the beep went off as my eyes were following a car, because I was noticing how blue it was. It was like a very bright cyan blue. Um, and I noticed that my eyes were following that car at the moment of the beep, but I was also thinking at the same time, I was thinking the words, "you have to decide." Um, that was my experience at the moment of the beep.
And are you more into the car or more into the you have to decide portion?
Um, I feel like it was 50-50. It
Okay.
was like, yeah, the blueness of the car was definitely something that drew my attention quite strongly, but the words "you have to decide" were also very present.
All right. Well, let's start with the blueness of the car. So the car's going by, you see the car, and for whatever reason, you're attracted to the cyany blue of the car.
Yeah, it's because everything else in my field of visual perception wasn't as colorful as that, and it was a very striking cyan blue. So the moment I spotted it, without even wanting to, my eyes just followed it.
Okay. And when you say your eyes followed it, are you attending to your eyes, or are you saying, well, I'm seeing the blue and I'm continuing to see the blue and I'm continuing to see the blue, so my eyes must have been following.
Yeah, the latter. I was I was sort of yeah, I was
So
just following with
experientially, it's about the blue. I see the blue of this car, and the beep catches me in the act of it.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions about that aspect?
No, I'm good.
And then you have to decide. How is that present to you?
So that was present to me because it was kind of the tail's end of a thought process I was having. I was stood at the bus stop and I was actually thinking about my work. I was thinking about the book and I was thinking about the structure of the book. And I was thinking about the structure of one of the chapters in the book. And I was running through all these ideas in my head. And then, but then I sort of had the thought that I just had to pick something. I just had to decide basically how something would go in the structure of the book. And the words "you have to decide" basically appeared in my mind at the end of that thought process, and that was when the beep went off. But it was strange because it was, I don't know if strange is the right word, but I noticed that those words, I could hear those words in my head at the same time as I was seeing the cyan blue car and following it with my eyes.
And when you say you hear the words in your head, what exactly does that mean?
Um,
Well,
so
first off,
in,
let me ask a simpler question. So these exact words, quote, you have to decide, unquote, or would it
yeah,
be make up your mind is okay, or
no, it was the exact words you have to decide.
okay, and with an accent like you underline half, you have to decide.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
and
It was,
then so how are these words present to you?
it was almost, it was kind of like the auditory equivalent of the mind's eye, I guess. I didn't see them. I didn't see them as text as I have with other thoughts, like similar thoughts about words. It was more that I just heard them in my head. It was like a voice in my head, and it was similar to my voice, and it had, like as you said, the same accents and intonations. So in the same way that I would say you have to decide, it was almost like I could just hear that in my head.
And and so sometimes it's hard to tease apart, but there's a distinction to be made between I'm saying these in my head and I'm hearing these in my head.
Mm.
And I guess so first off, I think it's possible to say something in your head without moving your lips or without anything. So let's establish that as possible. Whether that's what happened for you is another story altogether. And then the
Mm.
distinction would be, does it seem like I'm saying to myself, you have to decide? Or am I hearing my voice being played back to me? You have to decide. You have to decide.
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I know the answer to that.
Okay. So let
Um,
me say two things. One is for some people that distinction is very clear, as clearly distinct as saying into a tape recorder, I have to decide, and hearing my voice coming back out of a tape recorder, you have to decide. Same person, same voice, same words, same inflection, same everything, except that one's speaking and one's hearing. So for some people, that's very clear.
mm,
And for other people, that's not so clear. And either way is fine with me. And I would say this is your second sampling day, and so it sometimes takes a while to tease those options apart. So the fact that you're saying, well, I'm not too sure, that's fine with me. Maybe on some sampling days now that we've had this conversation and others, that
yeah.
that either will become clear or not.
Could it be a bit of both, you think?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Because it's difficult to, I suppose there might be other experiences where it's much more clear cut that I'm saying it in my head or as opposed to hearing it. But this time, yeah, it was so difficult to, I couldn't tell because it was, I was having these thoughts about the structure of the book um, but at the same time, because I was trying to think and reason my way through these things, there was a bit of like construction. There was a bit of me sort of, I suppose, me saying things in my head. But then I think at the same time that might have then triggered things that then I would just hear. So I don't know if that precise moment you have to decide was the sort of conclusion of my thoughts being told to me or me saying it in my head, or a bit of both. I don't know.
Well, I would say we should just leave that as an open question. One of the characteristics of the descriptive experience sampling method is that we don't have to decide about a phenomenon at this particular time. If this is the kind of a phenomenon that is frequent or important for Joe, then we'll see other beeps tomorrow or next week or whenever, and we can figure it out then. So I would say we would prefer to actually gradually figure something out rather than speculate about it.
Mm, okay.
And
Yeah, that's
that's an essential feature of the method because and it comes from I think that most speculations are incorrect, including by me, and or especially by me, maybe you could say, and so I would prefer not to do them.
yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds yeah, that sounds right.
So let me ask one more question, then we'll move on to be two or anybody else has any questions about this. And that is, so you're contemplating chapter stuff and is that present in your direct experience at the moment of this beep, or is that sort of context and at the moment what I'm saying or hearing, you have to decide.
I think that had passed at the moment of the beep.
Okay.
The moment of the beep was very much orientated around those words. You have to decide. Um, so yeah, I feel like there was a kind of a gap between me thinking about the chapter structures and then me sort of either saying or hearing in my head, you have to decide.
Okay. Then I'm good. Anybody else?
I'm good. And I would just add to the conversation we had about the distinction between inner speaking and inner hearing. Those are one of those things where we probably, I mean, maybe we'll be able to clarify that in a future beat today if that's something that's relevant. But more importantly, I think the thing to note about this method is that because we've talked about it, the hope I think would be, Joe, that going forward in the next round of sampling, you may be better positioned to the next time a beep goes off and something like you have to decide here at this beep, maybe present another beep, you'll be in a better place to say whether this was spoken or heard, whether it was about producing the words or about hearing it. And in that way, that's why we call this sort of training, iterative training within the method, in that all these conversations are sort of both about today, but more importantly about the next time we do this.
Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds really good. I think it's interesting because it's like what you guys were saying last week. I think Russ, you used the words mindfulness on steroids. You're sort of you're noticing things, but you're having to learn how to notice things as well that you wouldn't necessarily. Well, you don't. I suppose until you've gone through, as you said, Cody, this training process, it's hard to almost have the vocabulary or the ability to notice things in the way that they're actually being experienced.
Right, I think that's right. But I would like to add one more thing to what Cody said, and that is that he said you might be more able to distinguish between speaking and hearing going forwards. That's true, but it's also the case that as a result of this conversation, what you discover might be that it's neither speaking nor hearing. It's something else that is off to the side. So I don't want it to seem like we're trying to set up some kind of a distinction between A and B.
Mm-hmm.
It could be C or D or E or a bunch of other stuff. Our object, like as you just said, Joe, is to sort of become more mindful, to become more skilled mindful and into whatever it is, A, B, C, D, Q,
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Number two.
So number two, so I was on a bus and I was looking out of the window and I noticed the beep went off as I was looking at a black cab and I was noticing the bright orange taxi sign that just says taxi on the black cab. But I was at the same time, I was also thinking, that my parents are getting old and that I should visit them more often.
And anything else present at the moment?
No, I mean, I suppose it was a busy crossroads. I was in Holborn in London, so I was also aware that there were very tall old buildings either side of me and that it was a very busy crossroads. Um, um, there was also a faint image in my head of my mother, like while I was thinking that thought about my parents getting old and I should visit them more. And that image, it was strange because I could definitely see it in my mind's eye, but it was almost like it was overlaid, on top of the taxi and the orange taxi light my attention was most focused on.
And any one of these things more prominent at the moment?
I think the thinking that I should visit my parents more often was the most prominent thing in my experience at the time. the black cab and the orange light, the orange taxi light, was also quite prominent, but I would say not as prominent as me having that thought and seeing a sort of very faint image of my mum. Yeah, it was almost like in all of the busyness, my mind had sort of found a point, if that makes sense, in that taxi cab and that orange light, and then I had that, and then I was thinking those things about my visiting my parents.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's start with the parent, the thought about the parents. So how is that present to you?
It was so it was present as a slight feeling of guilt, and like I felt a bit bad. Even though I do visit my parents like fairly often, but it was more a bit of a feeling of guilt. But it was also it was kind of mixed up with a feeling of um, like an awareness that they're getting old, they're getting older. Um, and I mean, strangely, I don't. The moment of the beep itself, I was thinking I need to visit my mum my parents more often, and I had the image of my mother. But leading up to that were the feelings of guilt and thinking about visiting them more often. And I also thought this was again just before the beep, but I was thinking about a conversation I'd had with a friend over dinner a few months ago, and he had told me that there's this website where you can type in the number of how often you visit home and how old your parents are and how old you are, and it tells you how many times you're likely to see your parents again before they die. And I think that had got, I don't know if, I don't think that sparked the thought, but that was like a part of the thought before I then had the feeling of guilt and the thinking that I need to visit my parents more often, and then having the image of my mother. Um, so yeah, it was sort of present as, I suppose, yeah, as a kind of partly as a memory from the conversation with my friend, but then partly also as just a feeling of guilt, and but more than anything, a feeling of awareness, like a discovery almost, like I need to visit my parents more often.
And so the deal with the conversation with the friend and the website and stuff, though, I take you to be saying, so this is a question, that was before the beep, though. That's not present to me at this moment. That's not directly present to me at
No,
this moment.
no, that wasn't present at the moment. That was like just before it. The actual the moment of the beep itself was predominantly an awareness, a kind of like a discovery, like I need to visit my parents more often, and a slight feeling of guilt as well, but it was difficult to tell if it was guilt or sadness. Um, I think maybe it was difficult to discern one of which of those two it was. Um, yeah.
And so the feeling of guilt, or what we're calling sadness here, is there any characteristics to that?
Can I interrupt that? Let's go with the heart of this, which is in the thinking about it.
Hmm. Yeah, what I was thinking about it.
Well, so I take you to be saying that at the moment of the beep, the center of this aspect of your experience is something like, well, I should be visiting my parents more often,
Hmm.
and that
Yeah,
that's a sort of a cognitive thing. I'm asking about that. Is that a cognitive thing?
yeah. It was a cognitive thing. It was also strangely a bit of a visual thing, which is why I could actually see an image of my mother sort of overlaid onto the taxi. Um, and it was predominantly a cognitive thing at that point, but there was also a small, I think a small bit of the experience was the feeling of sadness and guilt.
Okay.
Um,
And the cognitive thing, how does that present to you?
um, yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, it's just there. Uh, it's just the trying to put it into words. Um, it wasn't like it's strange because it wasn't an inner voice. I wasn't hearing myself say it, and I wasn't saying it in my head either. It felt more like my mind was suddenly aware of it, but without me saying or hearing it, or it felt less like I was involved, if that makes sense. It sort of it kind of just appeared in my consciousness. It didn't um, it didn't feel like I was constructing it. So as with the last beep, when I was thinking you have to decide, that felt to me like more of a construction on my part, like whether or not I was saying it or hearing it. It was the kind of inevitable conclusion to like some thought processes that I'd like that built up in my head. Whereas this didn't feel like that at all. This was more something that just appeared in my consciousness without, and it didn't feel like I was that involved with the thought.
So let's have a little bit of a side conversation. We'll bracket this off from the interest that you have. So what you have just done is to give a textbook example of the first appearance or early appearance of unsymbolized thinking. This and the way that you have done it is classic the way this appears. You're scratching your head. You're not exactly sure. It seems like it's strange. You don't know how to put it into words. And yet it's there as a kind of feeling, and what you have said about it is pretty specific. That there's an image, and that's not part of it. This is separate from it, and so that's an example of unsymbolized thinking. Now, the reason that I interrupted Cody is that if he went down the road to talk about feelings first, it would have deprived you, I think, of the opportunity to be confused, but clearly confused about the unsymbolized thinking. And the reason for that is that unsymbolized thinking is sometimes called a feeling because that doesn't have words in it. And so people say, well, it's feeling. If it doesn't have words, it must be a feeling or whatever. And the feeling aspect would have been confused. You would have gotten probably confused into that. And it would have destroyed the possibility of your discovering unsymbolized thinking for yourself. Mm-hmm. So we got to. But if you want to know what unsymbolized thinking is, then after I send you the tape, rewind to the beginning of this. Watch what you just said.
Yeah.
And so unsymbolized thinking is a phenomenon that I think is quite robust. I didn't hear any doubt at all in your account that you were thinking that.
Mm. Yeah, that's fascinating.
But
there's nothing to clutch onto. That's why is that why they say it's unsymbolized? There are not things you can grab hold of.
What unsymbolized thinking means, the unsymbolized of unsymbolized thinking means is that there's no word. So I can't say I was saying to myself, I should visit my parents, or whether my parents are getting old, or what. There's no word parents, no word old. And there's no essential image. You had an image of your mother, I guess, but we haven't talked about that yet. But that's not a part of this thinking. This thinking is its own experiential deal. And so the unsymbolized means no words, no pictures, no external kind of symbol. And many people think that's not possible. People in pretty high places, pretty high psychological or philosophical or whatever places think it's not possible. But I just think they're mistaken about it because they inspect their inner experience using armchair introspection, and armchair introspection heightens things like visual imagery. And if I sit down and say, well, what am I thinking about right now? Well, it puts me into a verbal frame of mind, and then I don't have the possibility for things like unsymbolized thinking.
Mm.
And so I think much of the psychological explorations are misguided because they don't go through the process that we're going through here, which allows you to discover for yourself. I didn't say let's go looking for unsymbolized thinking, Joe.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm going to spend a lot of time reading about unsymbolized thinking now. It's so interesting.
It is it is interesting. And one of the aspects that's sort of the most interesting thing about it is that this method is about the only way you can discover it.
Mm.
Maybe
Yeah.
meditation, maybe meditation, but meditation doesn't lead you directly into this discussion. And so the good point and the bad point is well, one of the characteristics is that a lot of people discredit this method because, well, Hurlburt says that people are thinking about things without words or imagery, and that can't possibly be true. So he must be fucked up.
Yeah, that seems crazy to me because, as you just said, like you need to be sort of there out in the wild to and have that sort of go through that. I mean, it is a discovery. It's like when you guys asked me that, I mean, I was trying to think like, oh, how did it appear? And then I realized there was no way it appeared.
Right.
And that was definitely experientially very different from the beat before, which was definitely more of a construction. And yeah, I don't think, yeah, if I tried to like evaluate that or discover that like much later on or going back, as you said, you would just be then using constructions to basically make something up,
Right.
which is not there. Yeah, that's amazing.
It is amazing, and it's totally simple at the same time. That's sort of amazing squared or something like that.
Cool.
So Cody, you want to go at the image? The image. So as the lecture for Cody here would be, you can't ask anything in the vicinity of feelings if you suspect that unsymbolized thinking is in the vicinity, because if you do, you'll screw up the unsymbolized thinking.
And I think that was a good that was so I guess as a observation of the process, I also, Joe, recognized what you were talking there sounded like unsymbolized thinking. And the reason why I had decided to ask about the feelings portion, which I think was misguided, but what I was trying to wrestle with at the moment was there was a bit of power when you were talking around like the surprise about sort of the discovery aspect of that thought. And I was wondering, I actually had thought in my mind, I'm like, is this more of an emotional thing as opposed to like, like meaning is this sort of an affective sort of a thing rather than an unsymbolized thinking thing? But
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Holber, what you talked about with the danger of sort of falling into that trap of assuming that, most people talk about unsymbolized thinking early on as a feeling, I think is well said. So
Well, after you've seen 20 or 30 more years of inner experience, it'll be totally obvious to you when unsymbolized thinking is appearing on the horizon, because they look just like Joe. That was a really good example of how unsymbolized thinking appeared. But let's go to the imagery.
Yeah. So then there's what you were calling a faint image of your mother, Joe. So
Yeah. Yeah. And that appeared sort of superimposed on top of the taxi cab and the orange light. So it was kind of because I was looking out the window, so it sort of appeared. It wasn't really in the window. It was sort of it was out the window, but it was in front of the orange light and the taxi, and it was just an image, a very faint image though. It wasn't like I could see the taxi and the orange light and everything behind the image. So it was faint and basically transparent. And it was just of my mother's face. Yeah, that's all it was. I don't know. I mean, not quite sure why it was there. It was just there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so just her face by meaning like just this portion, not the neck or
It was like there were the neck and the hair, um, but then like I feel it wasn't. Um, yeah, I mean it was her head, hair, and neck, and it didn't really, and it was quite large as well. Uh, yeah, and but she wasn't like looking at me. She was sort of looking away, and she looked as she does now, and and it was just. Um, Yeah, I'm just looking at my notes, but there was nothing else that I jotted down apart from just the faint image of her head. Um,
And by looking away, do you mean sort of in profile, or do you mean face towards you but eyes off to the side or
uh,
something?
Kind of in profile, it was like her face was like off to the right a bit.
and maybe this is a difficult question, but is this the case that this is sort of like I'm pretty clearly seeing my mom, but just the transparency, like if this were in, in a computer program, I've set the transparency quite high, so it's clear but transparent? Or is it sort of when I say faint and transparent, the whole thing is sort of blur, unarticulated or something like that? And so,
Yeah, it was more the second thing you said. It was more like it was kind of hazy. Um, um, it was a kind of it was a I mean it was blurry, hazy, almost kind of ghost like. It was just sort of just a sort of a very sort of faint haze of her face in profile looking to the right. um but there was something kind of sad about the image as well. She didn't I mean it was I couldn't really discern that much of a facial expression because it was quite faint and she was looking to the right. But I think maybe because maybe there was a that slight feeling of guilt and sadness. I think maybe was caught up in the image as well because she looked sort of a bit sad. Um, so, um, but it was I mean, it was fairly short-lived. So I don't know if I can describe anything more than that really. I'm worried that if I do describe anything more than that, I might just be what's the word? Confabulating, or I don't know, over interpreting. I don't know.
So can I give a little lecture here, a presupposition lecture? So excuse me, when we started out talking about the imagery, you said, well, it was transparent because I could see the orange light of the taxi cab, something like that. It's that because I would like us to focus on. So that because sort of implies that you have a theory that says, well, if I see her and I see the taxi cab and they both seem in the same direction, then she must have been transparent. Something in that ballpark. I'm not, I don't want to pin us down too much about that. What I would like us to do is to recognize that the world of perception does not follow the rules of physics. So the fact that you can see her out there and the fact that you can see the taxi cab out there and you can see them both and they don't interfere with each other does not, in the real world, that would imply transparency. But in the experiential world, it doesn't.
Mm.
And so if she's transparent, fine, I've got no problem with her being transparent. But let's not make her transparent because she had to have been transparent because I was still seeing the orange of the taxi cab light.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, yeah, it makes me think that I can't be 100% sure about the transparency, or maybe it was just a faintness, or I was aware that I could see both things, the taxi cab and the orange light and her. Um, and so I can't be 100% that, um, that I haven't I suppose that I haven't just used the rules of physics there to sort of try and make sense of it. It could be that she wasn't as faint or as transparent as I thought, basically.
So what's happening here is another textbook example, and you're doing great about this. This is perfect as far as I'm concerned. But it's another textbook example of what I call, after Husserl or whoever, the bracketing of presuppositions. So if you have a presupposition that perception has to follow the rules of physics, then that presupposition can screw you up, as you have just pointed out, in terms of your reporting. Because, if you start to say something that seems obviously wacky, well, that can't be right. So I got to go off to the side a little bit. So our task is what I, pirating Husserl and whoever, would say we got to bracket those presuppositions, which means, well, the real physical world does exist, but let's just not assume that those rules apply to perception. But the question is, what is characteristic? What is present to us? And let's not say it has to be this way or it has to be that way. The question is just the way it is.
Okay.
And I'm delighted with your coming to the conclusion, well, yeah, maybe I did that, and now I'm not so sure. And that's perfect from my point of view. That's the sign of a good, careful, well-motivated guy. And it is the reason why descriptive experience sampling has to unfold over some number of days. So I could have told you at the beginning, well, let's make sure, last week or 2 weeks ago or whenever, I could have said, the rules of physics don't apply. It wouldn't have, that wouldn't have had any really effect on you, or if it had an effect on you, it would probably screw things up even worse than they would be now. But now we can say, well, Joe's got a particular example of how, well, in my experience, these rules do seem to apply. And now I got to figure out what to do about that. That's Joe learning to bracket his own presuppositions, on his own turf, in his own territory, so to speak. And there's no way to do it other than to be iterative and have people who are skilled at sniffing presuppositions when they occur and non-judgmentally saying, well, let's figure out how we can bracket them.
Yeah, you sort of have to go through it to realize that you're doing it. It's almost like you need to be immunized against it.
I think that's right.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. I think that's so useful to think. It's so useful to think of it in that way as well. The bracketing of presuppositions, because I feel like it's more not more freedom, but more, it's a stronger ability, I suppose, to actually describe and notice your experiences in the way that they're actually appearing, as opposed to, as you said, yeah. I suppose there's still parts of the mind that are creating rules that don't apply to the actual experience.
Right. I would say a lot of my art, or the DES art, is to be sensitive to when it looks like possibly people are operating on a presupposition rather than a description. And I'm no mind reader. I have no particular insight into Joe's inner experience. What I am, I'm pretty careful listener. And so when he uses words like because, when he says something like, well, this is faint because I was seeing the orange light. Well, I've been around the block a few times, and I've heard that kind of thing come into presupposition. So the art of DES is to recognize that might be a presupposition, might not be, because I'm not a mind reader, and to say, well, if it is, then let's bracket it, and if it's not, then you can just, well, our word was on the wrong track here at this particular point. So the art of the interview is to to non-dogmatically bracket presuppositions, I guess.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's aspirational as well, right? Like we're never going to, I think we're not striving for perfection where we bracket everything, but we do our best where we can. And,
yeah,
so I think that's also another part of this too. It's important. And that's why we take a team approach too, so that, clearly this wouldn't happen if it was just Joe and Dr. Hobart doing this, or Joe and Cody, or Joe and Amber, right? Like if there's multiple people here, we're all bracketing our own presuppositions, the presuppositions of others. And so.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing to do, but I can see that it's really essential. I'm just going to quickly turn the light on. Okay. Yeah, no, that's really useful and really important to know, actually. Great. Okay.
So I think we've probably beat number 2 to death, and we got to move on to number 3.
I think so.
Before we go on, I have a question about the sign in the taxi. So you're mentioning the bright orange of the sign and the black taxi. Are those colors prominent in your experience, or is it, are they two separate things, or is it just I'm looking at the taxi and the sign is catching me, or something else?
So the color orange was quite prominent in the experience, and the brightness of the orange as well, because it was during the day. It's quite bright outside anyway, and normally when you see these bright orange black taxi lights, you notice them at night, obviously, and I noticed the brightness of it because it was almost as if there was a bit of surprise of how bright the orange of the taxi sign was, given how bright it was outside. And I think that a part of the thing that that drew me to it was that little bit of surprise as well. Like there's a really bright orange taxi light there, and it's really bright orange, even though it's really bright outside.
Okay. So is there anything about the cabness in your experience, or is that more context? I'm looking at this cab and the sign happens to be on top of a cab. Or does that distinction not make sense?
So do you mean like was the cab like separate from the sign, or like
Yeah, in your experience, or is it I'm into the black of the cab, I'm into something about the cab, or am I just into the sign that happens to be on a cab?
Yeah, it was more that I was into the orange sign that happened to be on the black cab.
Okay.
So while I'm in my lecturing mode, let me give you one more lecture here. So when you described the orange, you explained why it was, well, the orange was here because it was the traffic or whatever. We're not particularly interested in that explanation, and for a number of reasons. One is it's just too complicated, and two is it's probably not true. And if it is true, it's only sort of partially true. So the world of explanations is not our bailiwick, I guess I would say. So it would have been fine with me if you had said, well, I was just into the orange sign and that was it, for whatever reason, I don't know, just the orange.
Oh, yeah.
The oranges. So it's about the experience. It's not about the explanation of the experience.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because the explanation is something totally different and irrelevant to the experience.
It is. And the reason that this is important for why I'm telling you, because you're writing a book about this stuff, is that that people like you and almost everybody else are find it easier to go to explanations than they do to go to experience. And so science is built on explanation. Psychological science is built on explanations, and they build them on, and the explanations come before they have an adequate grasp of what the phenomenon is. That, I think, is the fundamental nature of the book that you're writing about. It's about people who write explanations without adequately knowing about the phenomenon. And the reason is Well, because they're written by people like you, and we haven't yet figured out that you have to look at you have to bracket away explanations in order to get at
Yeah.
phenomena. And I'm not opposed to explanation. I'm totally in favor of explanation. I'm trying to give an explanation right now, but I'm opposed to giving explanations before the phenomenon is understood, and I'm particularly opposed to believing explanations before they have been tied to the phenomenon,
Mm.
which is
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's like I suppose it's maybe similar to the hypothesis-driven science model where you have an idea about something, right? And instead of just observing the data and you're over-interpreting and analyzing and coming up with stuff that then, as you said, you haven't really understood what the observation or the phenomena actually is.
right. Science is totally hypothesis driven. Psychological science dramatically so. And I don't think that's sustainable. Sooner or later, psychology has to recognize that hypotheses have their point. I'm totally in favor of hypotheses. I've written a statistics textbook. I'm a believer in hypothesis testing, but they're almost always way premature before you've really understood what the phenomenon you're trying to measure.
Okay.
But that's an aside. So Amber's going to ask you about beat number 3.
Yeah.
On to
So,
B3.
so beat number 3. I was on the tube on the London Underground, and I was sitting down, and the beep went off at the moment that I noticed a small black mark on the seat opposite me, and I was staring at it, and while the word light, the word light kind of appeared in my mind. I was wondering. I mean, so yeah, it was part of a thought process that I was having before the beep went off. That thought process, just as a quick aside, I was thinking more on the bus, and I'm not thinking really anything on the tube. And I was thinking it was so light outside. Maybe it's because it wasn't. Maybe it's because it's dark. But the beep went off as I was noticing the black mark and noticing the word light in my head. The only other thing that was present was the vibrations and rumble of the train and a screeching sound as well.
And are any of these things more prominent to you?
The black mark was the most prominent thing.
Okay.
And can I ask one more presupposition question before we get too far down the road? So to my presupposition antennae, which I have a lot of, as you no doubt are noticing here, I'm wondering whether the vibration, rumble, and screeching is in your experience, or whether that's a characteristic of the world out there. And then when I stop and take stock of the world, I say, well, I must have been paying attention to that stuff.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to that, because the rumble, the actual feeling of being on the train, the rumble, the vibration, the screeching, I was aware of that more after the moment of the beep. I mean, it was there all along, but I don't think it was. I don't think it wasn't as present at the moment of the beep. So it could very well be that the moment the beep went off, I noticed my experience, and then and then as I was jotting down notes as well, I think it's possible that some of that was a presupposition that I was, as you said, trying to maybe fit into trying to make more sense, trying to relate the experience more to the real world maybe than it actually was.
So I think that's possible. As I said, I'm not a mind reader. Let me tell you why I asked that question. One is Amber treated them as if they were three separate deals in experience, which I thought was a little bit out ahead of the possibility of the third one being presuppositional. But the reason that my presupposition antennae jangle is because it is, everybody would say about the tube, well, you know, it rumbles and screeches and vibrates. But those are three pretty separate sensations. There's the auditory and the mechanical and the whatever. And that would make it, if you, for example, if you had said, as number three, I was noticing the screech of the wheels, I would have known, my presupposition antennae probably would have been okay about that. But when you give a generality that is applicable to the tube and not the way sensations actually sort of generally work, well, then my presupposition antennae.
Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I think that probably was a presupposition. That the actual moment of the beep, the thing that I was most starkly aware of was the black mark. I was just staring at the black mark, and the word lights was in my mind at the time.
And I'm going to turn it back over to Amber, but I'm going to give you one more lecture as a book writer. Science would have been interested in your experience of the screeching, vibrating, whatever, which didn't exist, and wouldn't have been interested in your black mark and the word light, which did exist, and they would have talked about that as if you were having experience, and it would have been 100% wrong. And that's the root of psychological science.
Yeah.
And what was going on with you when you were on the tube? Well, I was paying attention to the vibration and the screeching and the whatever. And then that would have been accepted as fact, and then we would have tried to explain.
Yeah.
And so it's a big deal to me.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because now I'm thinking it's almost like I'm sort of a bit annoyed with myself that I can't sort of hone my awareness more, if that makes sense. It's almost like it's almost like the presuppositions sort of take you away without you realizing.
Yes, they do. And this, I want to make 100% clear, this is not a criticism of Joe. This is Joe at least has the good sense to have sought us out and tried to figure out something about it. Most people are just sailing along in their presuppositions without ever thinking about it. So Joe's ahead of the pack of presupposition records.
Yeah.
But it's you know, the world has taught you to pay attention to the theories and not pay attention to the actual phenomenon. Your entire training has been in that direction, both formal training and informal training.
How does it? Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask, like, I suppose it depends on the person, but I mean, so that can be unlearned. You can train yourself not to do that.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
And we're in the process of doing it right now. We're on our second sampling day, and Joe has discovered two pretty different but pretty significant presuppositions that infect his own way of looking at his own experience. One is that visual experience has to be the way that it is, and the other is well, auditory experience has to be, well, maybe it is and maybe it's not. So I'm not in the business here specifically of saying, well, you weren't hearing the vibration or feeling the vibration or hearing the screech or whatever. I don't have any idea about that. I don't know. I am in the business of pointing out well, you got to pay attention to that. Let's only be talking about what's going on at the moment of the beep and not try to make any stuff up. And that it's a fairly high art. You have to be attuned to a lot of stuff going on, and you have to have a sort of a clinical deal. I've got to support you. I can't say, you're like a stupid guy you are. You're not even paying attention to your.
Yeah, it's almost like the mind wants to tell a story, right? It's always wanting to tell a story instead of actually figuring out what the plot is at the moment.
I think that's right. And what I would say is, I think, and I'm maybe I'm mistaken, maybe I'm unusual in this regard, but I think that the Joe's actual experience is more interesting than the story. We haven't yet talked about it, but the mark and the word light are way more interesting than, I was paying attention to the rumble and the screech, and who gives a shit about the rumble and the screech? Everybody hears rumble and screech. That's the way the two-bit is. You could be wax poetic about that or whatever. It would not be interesting.
Yeah.
Black mark on the seat, light. Yeah, those are gonna turn out to be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason that they're going to turn out to be interesting is that they're uniquely Joe. There's for whatever reason, Joe is interested in that kind of stuff. And the rest of that stuff, that's an average across 2 billion riders of the tube.
Yeah. 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 It's a very good point. Okay.
I've given several pretty long lectures here. So Amber, you want to find out about mark on the seat here? And
so is the black mark like more prominent, like way more prominent than light, or just a little bit, like 60-40 or like 90-10, or the numbers don't really matter, but just so we can get an idea?
It was more prominent than the word light. I'd say about 70-30. It was definitely the most prominent thing.
Okay.
The word light was also was definitely quite prominent.
Okay. So let's start with the black mark. Tell me more about how you are noticing that.
So I can see it on the seat opposite me, and it's a small sort of misshapen black mark, and it's against the chair is blue, but it's the black mark itself. It's just it was small against the blue chair, but it was I don't it's really hard to explain.
No. Yeah. So I guess I'm wondering, are you into the shape of it, the size of it, the color, or something else? Or is it just I'm looking at this mark, or is something I didn't say, anything else? Is that distinction not making any sense? Like,
I was noticing the blackness of it. It was very dark black, and the shape as well. And it wasn't like I was sort of just looking around and it caught my gaze. There was definitely I was definitely focused on it for some reason. I was sort of staring quite intently at it. I didn't it didn't just sort of catch me mid thought flight, if that makes sense. I was very much sort of just staring at it. Yeah, it was very much, yeah.
Oh, is there anything else?
No, just, I mean, I was almost going to say that the mark was it sort of appeared to be like the only thing that was going on, essentially, in the experience. And it was certainly like most of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is this intense staring, is that part of your experience, or is that what we like to call like a fact of the universe? Like, well, I'm looking at this, I've been looking at it, and so I'm saying I'm intently staring at it, or is that something about this intense staring or staring in general, anything like that in my experience at the moment of the beep?
Um, so um, wait, could you just can you
Yeah,
repeat?
yeah. So is there anything about the staring or the intense staring or anything like that? Is that present to me at the moment of the beep, or is it just my eyeballs are aimed in the direction I'm caught at? I'm catching this mark.
Oh, I see. Um, no, there was definitely something about the intensity of staring. Um, so I was aware that I was staring at it as well. Um, so it wasn't, yeah, it wasn't the kind of use the words fact of the universe that I was sort of happened
Hmm.
to be staring at it at the moment of the beep. Um, something about it felt a bit more purposeful, uh, if that word makes sense. But again, that might just be presuppositional explanation. I mean, it was.
Let me see whether I can rephrase the question because my presupposition and Tanya are jangling. So what Amber is asking is your is this for this aspect, this 70% of your experience, is this aimed at the mark or is this aimed at me and my intensity as I look at the mark?
It's aimed at the mark.
That's what I figured. And as a point of technique, sort of a lecture for Amber as well as for Joe here, that when you ask, so when an interviewer asks you a question and the person is nonplussed about the answer, that should be taken as a really clear no. And then if he says yes after that, that's going to be presuppositional. So Joe didn't, in this particular case, Joe didn't understand what the question was and said, "Oh yeah, can you ask me that question again?" And then at the end,
Hmm.
and then you asked the question again, and then he said, "Well, yeah, there was an intensity about it or whatever." That's that's a behavioral no, that this wasn't an important part of
Hmm.
the question, followed by a yes, which light up my presuppositional antennas. Well, Amber led him down the wrong path, and he'd been into it or something. So what I'm trying
Okay.
to say is there's no mind reading involved. I am by no means a mind reader. I am listening to what's going on here. So I think we're good about the blackness of the mark.
Yeah, I
Then the
think so too.
word light.
Yeah. How is the word light present to you?
Uh, it was it was partially visual, so I could see the word itself, light. Uh, strangely, it it almost appeared. I was staring at the black mark. The word light. It kind of well. I'm just going to say it because this is basically how it appeared. It was the actual word light was like in big capital letters, which were each in like sort of they were like white big capital letters that were white that spelt the word light, and that was a sort of on top that was on top of the black mark, uh, sort of just above the black mark. Uh, it was almost as if it was in the carriage itself. Uh, yeah. Um, so it was, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's strange, but there was sort of uh, there was something there was something to do with wood as well, like in the way that there was the word light. It appeared in that way, but there was also a sort of it was I think it was fairly visual of a plank of wood and light shining on the plank of wood, and the word light was sort of in front of that. So it almost made the word light kind of look like a sign. Um, uh, there was something really peculiar about the way I was experiencing the word light whilst looking at the mark. I'm trying to explain it without sounding a bit mad. uh, yeah.
So could I intervene here and say there's what we're interested in, what you see, whether it's strange or weird or whatever is not particularly of interest to us. What's of interest to us is what it is that you see. And everybody has their own unique ways of looking at it. And that's what makes people interesting. That's what makes Joe and whatever. So let's see whether we can set aside whether it's weird or crazy or mad or whatever and describe what you saw.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so it was in big capital letters. They were white, and it was on top of the black mark, but there was what appeared to be a sort of a plank of wood immediately behind the word light, and there was actually light shining onto the word light. So, and it kind of it almost looked like a sign, like a sign like it almost looked like a sign that had the word light written on it, like on a board. But again, but it wasn't as it still wasn't as present as the black mark. It was just there on top of the black mark, and I was aware of it. Yeah, I mean, it was mostly visual. But the thing is, there was yeah. I mean, there was a sense of absence as well. It's in like it was. I was aware I was also aware that it that it that it might have been symbolizing that I was aware that there was no light where I was. I can't be completely sure about that though. It was more of a visual thing, although it was, as I said before, I think it was the result of me having the thought processes leading up to the beep about how I was thinking more things on the bus, and that's because there was more light on the bus, and that where I was at the moment it was just dark. So, but that's probably presuppositional explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. That's how it appeared. The word light.
Okay.
That's great. In my role as timekeeper, I would say we've overshot our hour by 10 minutes. And in my role as observer of the whole process, I would say, I guess maybe I said it before, but I'm going to repeat it. You're doing a great job, Joe, of describing your experience. These things are not easy to describe, and it's a way of talking that you haven't relatively little practice in doing, probably. And so we're asking questions which are tough, and And I think if these are complicated. All human interactions are complicated. This one is complicated, and so I think we're trying to keep track of those complications. And I'm hoping we can do it again because I think it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I find it so fascinating that the idea that there's training involved in this, what you were talking about with the bracketing the presuppositions and being more aware of actually what you're experiencing, as well as, yeah, not trying to fit it into, yeah, actually like experiencing the thing you're experiencing rather than just going on the tracks that you're sort of already pre-programmed with. So I that's fascinating to me.
Well, let me say one more thing about that at the risk of wasting everybody's time, but it's something that I haven't written about bracketing and presupposition, and it's pretty clear in this model. I guess I have written it, but I haven't been too explicit about it. One cannot give a lecture in the abstract about bracketing presuppositions. If I had given a lecture about bracketing presuppositions before we had started here, that would have just built more presuppositions in your construct of, or more theories, I guess I should say, more little theories or whatever, more constructs in your system of constructs. Instead, what we have done is we say, look here, Joe, at this particular moment, looks like maybe you, Joe, not Sam or Bill or whoever else, you may be imposing some self-theory, world theory, whatever. And so the difference is it's not, a presupposition is not a thing in general. It's a personal thing about Joe. And that's why you can't give a lecture about bracketing and presuppositions and expect it to do anything except make things worse. A lecture about bracketing presuppositions just builds more structure. Whereas, look here, Joe, maybe at this particular time you were thinking that had to be transparent because that's a different deal. That's aimed at it in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's sort of, you have to be aware of it kind of in real time almost.
In real time and in real person. It's about Joe's presuppositions. It's not about presuppositions. It's about what might happen in Joe, not in general, or what is happening in Joe, or what might be happening, but about something that happened with Joe. That's the key. And it's looking that way as opposed to looking that way. Or it's actually looking that way. I'm not pointing at a picture of Joe. Rather than looking this way, people in general, well, people in general sometimes have presuppositions. That's a totally different deal.
Okay.
But that's just taking farther past our hour. And
yeah, I'd love to do this again. I feel like I'm just starting to understand it in the way that I should. So yeah, are you guys up for doing it again fairly soon?
the rest of this week is pretty tough for me.
5 works. In terms of, so I think this time I will, even though I've taken today off, so today would basically be like Sunday. I think although I don't know. I mean, again, so is it better to do it on the day as opposed to the day before?
It doesn't much matter. 2 days matters. 1 day is okay.
Okay. Well, I'll either do it the day before or again on the day as I've done today. In terms of like where to do it. So far it's just been, again, me sort of in the wild doing things that I would just go and do and normally do. But I'm curious about whether or not should I make more of a conscious effort to go and do things that I would say do, but not like that often, to get different experiences, or yeah, I don't know.
I would say the more you try to meddle in it, the worse it gets.
Okay.
Sooner or later, if we sampled a half a dozen times or whatever, you'd probably see a bunch of different kinds of experiences that would just sort of naturally happen by the nature of randomness. At that time, it might be interesting for you to speculate. I haven't done it while I've been, whatever X would be there, and then I should sample at that time, and that might be a good idea.
Yeah, but for now, just stick to no meddling, totally in the wild. Just yeah, okay. Yeah.
The reason for that is that if you were to say, well, I haven't done it doing X, that would be your presupposition that something is going on in X that might be interesting. Well, maybe that's true, but what that does is that sort of raises the presuppositional stakes. Well, I got to find something interesting, something here. I got to find something here that I'm not finding anywhere else. I would rather have you get some more practice at just describing experience as it is, presupposition bracketing experience, you could say, and then you can do what you want to do after that.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think that, yeah. So I'll just, I'll carry on just doing whatever I happen to be doing at that time. So
I think that's fair.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you all so much.
You're welcome. And I will send you the video sometime later on today. And
yeah,
it takes a while to process, but.
And just to make sure we're on the same page here, are we saying 9 a.m. Pacific time, 5 o'clock London time, next week, Monday the 20th?
Yeah.
Is that what we decided on? Works for me.
Thank you.
Works for me too.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Joe. Have a good one.
See you later, Joe.